Now I know what you're thinking, X2, what about X1? The first X-Men movie was a game changer when it came to how superhero movies were treated. Where's that review? And to that I say, Disney, in all of its divine wisdom, chose not to add the first X-Men movie to Disney Plus when it added pretty much all the other X-Men movies. There are a couple other exceptions. Why that is, I have no good idea, but I was feeling nostalgic for those classic X-Men movies, and after seeing X-Men 2, which is on Disney Plus, I got stuff to talk about. X2, X-Men United. Now X2, I'm just going to call it X-Men 2 just for the sake of clarity. X-Men 2 came out in 2003, was directed by Bryan Singer, and for reasons that I'm sure everybody knows already, I'm not really going to be talking about Bryan Singer. I just want to talk about the movie itself, and it was the much anticipated follow-up from X-Men 1, and it brings back all your favorite characters from that movie. And when I do get around to reviewing X-Men 1, I'll go into more detail explaining why this cast is amazing, but you just got some perfect casting right out of the gate. You got Wolverine, played by Hugh Jackman. You got Professor Xavier, played by Patrick Stewart. Halle Berry as Storm. James Marsden as Cyclops. Even Femke Jensen as Jean Grey is pretty on-the-nose casting, at least for these first two movies. We'll talk about how they kind of butcher a lot of these characterizations in the third movie, again, when I get to that one. But we're talking about this movie, X-Men 2, and for this movie, they all play their parts pretty spot on. And how could I forget to mention Ian McKellen as Magneto? That's just inspired casting. He's great. But then we also have a bunch of returning casts that I wouldn't say are perfect, but they're not bad either. They're just kind of okay. And starting off the list, let's talk about Rogue. Now, Rogue, played by Anna Paquin in these movies, she's fine. She's a teenager from the South that realized she was a mutant. She can't touch anybody or they might die. And that's enough for her to just not want to touch anybody. And that's really hard to deal with. I understand that. That's key to Rogue's character arc. She can't be touched. She's closed off physically as well as usually emotionally from other people. And that's a good sense of conflict. And Anna Paquin plays that side of Rogue very well. The downside for me is that we never see that Miss Marvel powered Rogue that we get in the cartoon or the Jim Lee X-Men comics. And it really is a shame because that gave Rogue more capability as a superhero. Instead of just being this recluse that can't touch anybody, she can actually go on missions and be a force for good and just kick butt with the rest of the team. This Rogue, you don't really get that as much. But the other mutants I think are just kind of fine are Shawn Ashmore as Iceman, Daniel Cudmore as Colossus, and Aaron Stanford as Pyro. Now that I think about it, the complaints I have with these movies is actually mostly around the younger teenage class, and I get it that they wanted to give Rogue a love interest, and Bobby was the perfect choice for that, I guess, even though Rogue is usually more closely associated with Gambit, and Gambit just doesn't appear in these movies. I think that was kind of a wasted opportunity. Plus, Bobby was supposed to be one of the original X-Men, and they made him much younger, so that's kind of weird if you're looking at it from an adaptation perspective. But to counter that, I do really like the idea that Bobby and Pyro are friends at the start of this movie, even though if you know the comics, you know that Pyro becomes a bad guy. He joins the Brotherhood of Mutants, and he's British in the comics too, which he's not really British here. And again, I think that is another missed opportunity. Again, talking about adaptation, wanting to see a more comic accurate Pyro. And weirdly enough, that bothers me more than making him younger. I think seeing mutants at different ages lends to some interesting things. But for me, I just wish they kept his ethnicity the same so that he just felt more like comic book Pyro when he made that decision later in the movie. And with Colossus, I don't really have many issues with how they did Colossus. Sure, he's not Russian. I would have liked to see him have a little bit of a Russian accent. I think that would be fun. But how he's used in this movie, he's really not used much at all. He actually gets used much more in the third movie. But weirdly enough, he has fewer lines in the third movie than he has here. He actually speaks quite a bit. He's this older teenager. He's the one that you think might join the X-Men first. Like, he's right on that edge of joining the X-Men, but he's just a little too young and inexperienced. But you do see him start to take charge, take some initiative in this movie, and you do see the potential of where they could go with him later. But with him, I guess my frustration lies more in how he's depicted in X-Men 3 than he is in this movie, because in this movie, he's perfectly fine. But that's enough setup. Let's talk about what really happens in this movie, because tensions are heating up between the human and mutant world. After the events on Liberty Island, things are a bit more tense. Mutants are more public than they've ever been. And the movie starts off with an amazing sequence in the Oval Office as Nightcrawler infiltrates the White House, getting closer and closer and closer to the Oval Office to execute the president. And he almost does it. He has the president at his mercy until whatever mind-altering drug wears off and he becomes conscious and he's like, what am I doing? And he poofs out of there. I'm sorry, bamfs out of there. That's the accurate term for what Nightcrawler does. And Nightcrawler is the reason why this may be my favorite X-Men movie ever, because I love Nightcrawler so much. He's my favorite character. For me, he's the character that totally embodies what it means to be an X-Men. Because there's no hiding his mutation. You look at him and you're like, this is just a blue demon. Like, it's very in your face how deformed and mutated he is. It's probably one of, if not the most obvious mutations that you can see at a distance. Either him or Beast. Beast is the other one. But what I love about Nightcrawler is that despite the persecution that he experiences practically on a daily basis, he doesn't let that make him bitter or resentful or angry with humans. And in this movie, a lot of that is because of his faith. Now in the comics, how much faith Nightcrawler has fluctuated depending on who's writing it, but the through line between whatever Nightcrawler comic you read, he's either a swashbuckling adventurer, optimistic, like little boy who loves playing with swords and jumping around, and he grew up in the circus, so he has that kind of Errol Flynn, Douglas Fairbanks swashbuckler attitude all the time, which again, love me some Errol Flynn, so again, Nightcrawler's just the perfect mutant for me. But in this movie, he's deeply religious, and his religious convictions don't give him an excuse to hate people. Because if you believe the Bible, you know that we're supposed to love our enemies, to turn the other cheek, to offer forgiveness even if they don't deserve it. Those are core Christian beliefs. And as a mutant, I can only imagine how difficult it is to uphold those beliefs in the face of active persecution and hatred. So yeah, Nightcrawler, great addition to this cast. The opening sequence is awesome, the slow-mo, the teleporting, but sadly because of this attack it makes humans even more fearful about a mutant uprising, which is everything Magneto wanted. And we meet the real antagonist of this movie, Colonel William Stryker, played by Brian Cox. And Stryker is a mutant hater. He's a colonel in the army, he's very experienced, older guy. He believes a war is coming. No, he believes a war is already here, and he is set on exterminating all the mutants before they can exterminate us. And his first attack is on the X Mansion. He's like, okay, we're gonna not exterminate them, we're just gonna wrangle them up and just figure out what they can do, what they know, and investigate this whole mutant thing. At least that's what he tells the president to get approval for this operation. And it's about here where we get the second out of the three really cool, awesome, probably best of the franchise action sequences in this movie, and that is the attack on the X Mansion. And Wolverine is there babysitting the kids. All the other adult X-Men have either gone out looking for Nightcrawler or gone to see Magneto to see what he knows about this whole thing. So it's really just Wolverine as the kids' only line of defense, aside from all the kids' mutant abilities that they do show off in some pretty creative ways. But the real highlight of the scene is Hugh Jackman's Wolverine just going berserk on these guys in the X-Mansion, just taking out goons left and right, just slaughtering them. He's getting shot in the shoulder with these little tranquilizer darts, but his healing factor is counteracting the drug, so he just kind of shakes it off. If there was any doubt left in anybody's mind as to whether or not Hugh Jackman was the perfect Wolverine, even though he's 6 foot and Wolverine's supposed to be shorter, this sequence right here is your proof. But aside from a bunch of satisfying action, this scene actually brings full circle a quote, I think it was at the end of the first movie, but I think it was also brought in at the very beginning of this movie. And it's when Charles and Magneto are playing glass chess in the prison, and Magneto asks him, does it ever wake you to wonder if they'll pass that foolish law or something like it, that they'll come for your children in the night and take them away? And Charles gives the perfect response. He says, I do indeed, and I have a great swill of pity for the poor soul who comes to my mansion looking for trouble. And in this movie, we see exactly that. You got a bunch of people looking for trouble, and it's a lot harder than they originally expected to actually wrangle up all these kids. They actually didn't end up getting that many. I think they got like 6. And then Colossus steps up and helps the rest of them escape. And I love seeing Colossus, love seeing him take charge. Really wish they did more with his character later in the movie, but nevertheless, it was nice to see him lead all the younger mutants to safety. And I guess here's about as good a time as any to really bring up the question as to whether or not this is an adaptation of the X-Men comic God Loves, Man Kills. Because if you haven't read it, God Loves, Man Kills is a classic X-Men story. It's amazing, written by Chris Claremont. And it seems like everybody agrees that that was turned into X2. In fact, the copy of God Loves, Man Kills that I have has a little prologue, and it explicitly says that this was the inspiration for X2. But aside from the general theme of hatred and mutant persecution that's really present in all X-Men comics, I would say, it's not specific to God Loves, Man Kills, even though that comic book does put a pretty fine point on it. The only other thing that I see in common is the character of William Stryker himself. But even then, it's not really the same character, is it? Brian Cox's Colonel William Stryker is a military man. He's the one that was directly responsible for putting the adamantium on Wolverine's bones, giving him the claws, really central to Wolverine's backstory. And that's not at all the William Stryker from the comic. In the comic, he's a televangelist, he's a rogue preacher. He had a mutant son that ended up killing his wife, and so now he's very resentful and bitter. Which, okay, the whole mutant son killing his wife idea is present in both depictions, but really the execution is so different where I kind of consider these two different stories. And I think it's because this movie really wants to explore Wolverine's backstory in a way that also includes all the other X-Men to make it an X-Men movie and not just a Wolverine solo movie. And to that end, I think this movie really succeeds, and is why I consider this more of an original story akin to the first X-Men, which was a totally original story. In fact, I would say the Dark Phoenix saga and X-Men 3 are a more closely related adaptation example. Now, granted, it's a very different take on that story, but I still see the connective tissue between Dark Phoenix and X3 much more than I see the connective tissue between God Loves, Man Kills and X2. But now we're getting to the third act of this movie, and to set this up, Charles Xavier has been captured. Cyclops has also been captured. He got his little neck injection like Nightcrawler got in the beginning of the movie, so he's under Stryker's control. And what Stryker's real plan has been all along is to attack the X-Mansion, wrangle up some kids, also take what they need to build their own Cerebro device, you know, the thing that Charles uses to find all the mutants. Well, it turns out if you have a telepath that focuses hard enough on one particular mutant or a mutant community, it could kill them. It can just destroy their brains and they die. And to the surprise of nobody, that's exactly what Stryker wants to do. So he builds his own Cerebro, kidnaps Charles, puts him in the room with another mutant, his son, Jason, who's, I guess, mastermind in this universe. He doesn't really look or act like Jason Wingard, but he has the ability to create illusions and mindscapes that people get lost in and immersed in. And we do see that a little bit in the Hellfire Club with Jason and all that in the comics. So it's not the worst adaptation, and I kind of like this take on Jason. Even though it's different, you see Jason in this movie as this evil alternate version of Xavier. They're both these really powerful psychics that are wheelchair bound, so their physical body is not capable, but their mind is what's really powerful. And on top of that, he's just really unsettling to look at. He's got those different colored eyes. He's got scars on his forehead from being experimented on. He's got this metal spine. And in this version, Jason is the son of William Stryker, and you can tell that this is exactly how Colonel Stryker would treat his mutant son, especially after his mutant son killed his wife, and he said, okay, I have no son. You are now just an experiment. You are a toy that I can play with to unlock the secrets of mutation. And it shows. When you see him, you're like, yep, that person has been experimented on almost every day of his life, and now he is the thing that we see before us. But basically, Jason, under mind control of Stryker, is going to convince Charles through illusion, mindscape, to just exterminate all the mutants, to use Cerebro to wipe them all out. And that's almost what he does, if not for the uniting of mutants. You know, X-Men United, this is what that looks like. You have Magneto and Mystique, who are, I guess, whatever's left of the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, and the X-Men. They team up and they're going in to free Xavier. And as cool as it is to see these unlikely allies team up, because Magneto is such a sympathetic villain, you really want him to join the X-Men. That's really what you're rooting for in all of X-Men media. You want Magneto to see the error of his ways. But as great as that is, when the team up happens, I don't feel the weight that it should be of these two rivals coming together, they're uniting. It really just feels like the X-Men recruited two more mutants to their side and not these two rivals coming together. And I think it's because it's only Magneto and Mystique that joined the team. I think to really make you feel it a little bit more, the Brotherhood needed one extra person to join the team. And personally, I think it would have been nice to see Blob in the mix, because Blob and Pyro have always had this weird banter back and forth. They're kind of friends, but they don't like each other. They don't get along. They always pick on each other. And I would have liked to see that with John, that when John leaves the X-Men at the end of the movie to join the Brotherhood, that he has someone that he can kind of banter with, because he's not going to be bantering with Magneto or Mystique. They're just not that kind of person. But if you had a Blob or an Avalanche even, now we were talking. Now you can have a little bit of camaraderie among the Brotherhood. Just like how he had camaraderie with Bobby, I feel like you need that on the other side. But now I have to talk about the third and final epic fight scene in this movie, and it's the duel between Wolverine and Lady Deathstrike. Now, Lady Deathstrike is not the most comic accurate representation, but she is a really interesting visual presence, because she has the metal fingernails that she has in the comics, although in the comics it's more cybernetic. In this, it's adamantium. It's the same metal as Wolverine's claws. So now you have 6 claws against 10 fingernails, and it's a really visceral fight. You feel every slice, every stab. They both have healing factors that work about the same way, so you know that all this slicing and clawing, it's really getting you nowhere. And you see them trying to one-up each other, outthink each other, try to get them in a position where they just can't escape. And it's so cool. And I think the through line of this is it's so entertaining to watch mutants actually use their mutant abilities to cut loose and just go for it. If you think back in the beginning of the movie, you have that with Nightcrawler. Nightcrawler is just going for the president. There's nothing stopping him. He's just going, determined, no filter. He's not pulling any punches. He's gunning for him. And then in the same way, you have that with Wolverine in the X-Mansion. He is just unleashing havoc upon these goons. And again with Lady Deathstrike. Lady Deathstrike can take everything that Wolverine's dishing out, so it just escalates and becomes this feral madness that I just love to see. And we don't really see again until Logan, maybe, and that's like 10 years later. Well, Wolverine, of course, does end up getting the upper hand on Yuriko, Lady Deathstrike, in a visual way that I have never forgotten from the first time I watched this movie as a kid. And what he does is he takes the injector of adamantium, this like tube-like hose thing, and he jams it into her abdomen and hits release, and all the liquid adamantium just starts pouring into her body. It goes out of her eyes, her nose, her mouth, her ear, like it just overloading her with this liquid metal that hardens, and she dies. She sinks, and in a moment of perfect sound design, you see her sink to the bottom of this pool, and you hear the clink of her skull hitting the bottom of the pool, and I just thought that's the cherry on top of this fight. And for the rest of the runtime, it goes down about as you'd expect. Charles Xavier gets this close from executing all the mutants until Magneto comes in and gives counter instructions to then kill all the humans, so now the humans are about to die. And then in the end, nobody ends up dying. They end up getting Jason to surrender from making the room super cold. And in the end, it looks like there is some hope between mutant-human relationships as they deliver a message to the president in probably the most intense and threatening way they could have delivered this message. Even though they tell him it's not a threat, it's an opportunity, they still just teleported into the Oval Office with all the lights off, thunder and lightning happening. I don't know, if I were the president, I would definitely take that as a threat, but it's the X-Men. But how could I forget the fact that Jean Grey actually sacrifices herself at the end of this movie. Right before they deliver the message to the president, they're having trouble escaping this base. The dam's ruptured, it's flooding, water's about to just wipe out the X-Jet, and Jean Grey gets off the ship for reasons I still don't really understand, in order to hold back the water like Moses and also lift up the ship at the same time. And as we see that, her hair starts to glow a kind of fiery red. She's unleashing more power than she's ever had before. And once the jet is clear and safe on its way, she dies. The water comes in and drowns her. And every X-Men fan knew exactly what this meant, that Jean Grey had unleashed the power of the Phoenix, that she was going to rise up in the next movie and become either the Phoenix or the Dark Phoenix. And we were finally going to get the Phoenix Saga, or the Dark Phoenix Saga, probably the greatest run of X-Men comics ever. I can't undersell just how important those comics are for the character of Jean Grey, of Cyclops, of the X family as a whole. And now it looks like we're going to be getting that in movie form. How could they mess this up? Well, let me tell you, Hollywood, they messed it up twice. But that is a review for another day. But now I turn it over to you guys. What do you think about X2 X-Men United? Do you love it? Do you think it holds up all these years later? I was actually really impressed at how much this movie held up, both in special effects and also just in telling a good, gripping X-Men stories. It seemed to balance all the characters pretty well. But whatever you think, let me know in the comments. And if you like this video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe for more content, and hit the notification bell to be notified every time I upload a video. And as always, I'm Colby. This is my Nerdy Talk, and I'll see you in the next video.